It's a calm and pleasant Sunday in Boston, 1944. Italian soldiers in American uniforms maintain a victory garden, attend mass with locals, and enjoy delicious food. Just a few years earlier, they were behind bars in Texas, captured after Il Duce's disastrous desert campaign. But a single stroke of the pen changed everything. Across the Atlantic, Italian men shiver from the cold, hard labor, and lack of food. Hated by their captors and distrusted by their fellow prisoners, they suffer the full wrath of the Reich. Just a few years earlier, they were stationed on the sunny shores of Greece. But a single stroke of the pen changed everything. Few fates differ as radically as those of Italian soldiers during the Second World War. Although Italy fought as a loyal ally in the early war, the sudden 1943 armistice and side-switching changed the situation for many troops on the ground. The fates of many captured Italian soldiers also vary greatly. The British Empire was the primary processor of Italian POWs. After almost 200,000 Italians had been captured between fall 1940 and spring 1941, prisoners were sent far away from the home isles. Fearing security risks, many Italians were sent to Australia and South Africa instead. Nonetheless, by July, the first Italians started arriving in Britain. These men proved to be an asset in the local labor market, however, and so for the home isles too, economic demand won out over security concerns. British authorities saw the Italian prisoners as an economic asset to alleviate labor shortage on the home front. For that reason, many Italians were not held in camps, but rather on individual farms where their labor was needed the most. Although soldiers were screened for fascist sympathies, especially those heading for Britain proper, the guarding was very lax. Besides farm work, Italian POWs engaged in other non-war activities per the Geneva Conventions. They worked in forestry, civil engineering, and infrastructure projects like Kenya's Great North Road. Although conditions undoubtedly varied throughout the corners of the empire, conditions were relatively good. In Working Camp 37, in Winchcombe, England, the Italians were active in an agricultural camp. Built by prisoners themselves, their dwellings were well-insulated huts containing air heaters for the cold British winters. There was sufficient light, ventilation, water, running taps, and 3 rations a day. Prisoners were paid for their work, and it was limited to 8 hours per day. They enjoyed books, plays, music, and sport. Sundays were spent attending mass with local villagers, followed by football matches against their guards and the village team. Regular mail from Italy kept them connected, with opportunities to send a letter and a card each week. When the war ended, Axis soldiers returned home to countries devastated by years of conflict. Most had to learn new skills and take on new roles just to survive in the post-war world. If you're looking for a new role in today's technology-driven world, our sponsor, Boot.dev, uses game design tactics to make learning software development both practical and fun. By balancing theory with hands-on coding, it prepares you to pass technical interviews and launch a successful programming career. Learn back-end development with Python, SQL, and Go, or learn to code by building real projects, all while earning XP, unlocking achievements, and by completing quests and fighting bosses. Their new Training Grounds feature even gives you unlimited practice challenges to sharpen your skills at your own pace. Boot.dev's content is free to read and watch, but a paid membership unlocks interactive coding, AI assistance, progress tracking, and more. Every course includes a free demo, there's a 30-day refund policy, and you'll join a thriving Discord community for support. If you're ready to start your programming journey with Boot.dev, scan the QR code or click our link in the description and use code ArmchairHistorian for 25% off of your first year on the annual plan. Following the 1943 armistice, life changed considerably for Italian POWs in the UK. As Pietro Badoglio's new government aligned with the Allies, Italian captives had a choice. Those who cooperated enjoyed better conditions and freedom of movement, while non-cooperators were sent to more secure camps. Although the new government, and many Italians, wanted their soldiers returned home, the Allies were unwilling to give up this valuable labor force. Instead, the Italian POWs entered a strange legal limbo, where they were legally POWs of a nation that was now an Allied co-belligerent. In practice, this meant that the Italian prisoners were a flexible labor pool that Allied leadership could deploy anywhere, including in direct military work. In general, the experience of Italian POWs in the UK was relatively smooth. Although incidents of violence and clashes with the civilian population occurred, about 63% of the POWs chose to support the Allied war effort. After the war, the last POWs were only repatriated well into 1947. Italian labor proved far too valuable for the British Empire to release quickly. Many returned to Britain after their repatriation, for example, to marry the local women they met while in captivity. In the United States, the system was similar to the United Kingdom. When Italian captives began falling into American hands in early 1943, authorities hesitated to bring them to American soil, but economic demand again won out. POWs were put to work picking cotton, detasseling corn, and digging potatoes, all as replacement for those men who went to war. The conditions for POWs were good. One Italian serviceman recalls, at 6 p.m., the American soldier waiters returned with paper plates, wooden forks, and small glasses. For dinner, we have cheese, 1 egg, prosciutto, salad, iced tea, and grapefruit. We think we're in heaven. In particular, Italian mess sergeants had the freedom to choose their own help and create custom menus and dishes from scratch. Armchair turned into Italian cuisine, which even attracted American personnel to the POW compounds. During their free time, prisoners could enjoy sports, music, and theater. Camps included universities, where prisoners learned English, engineering, literature, and business. Educated internees even became POW professors. The US had its own program for Italian prisoners to contribute directly to the Allied war effort through Italian Service Units, or ISUs. 75% of the prisoners took this opportunity. These ISU units would help out in road construction, park cleaning, but also in military logistics. Although it's easy to frame them as simply auxiliary, these men also performed other crucial duties for the Allies. In one example, ISU soldiers used their native Italian to direct the partisans who fought Mussolini's fascist republic of Salo. Though officially prisoners, ISU men were paid like American privates and could get weekend passes. Although they enjoyed a very high standard of living for prisoners of war, the ISU path wasn't necessarily easy. Volunteers often felt inner conflict over the decision, as they were sometimes reluctant to take up arms against their fellow Italians and former allies. Despite the moral dilemma and hard work, American civilians occasionally complained that Italians were coddled. There was also friction between American units and ISUs. When American soldiers were dying en masse in northern Italy during 1944, it was hard for Americans to view Italians as co-belligerents. This animosity led to harassment and vindictiveness. Still, despite occasional run-ins, Italian POWs were treated well in the US, and ISUs were treated even better. One POW even reflects, "The Americans, they treated us too good, too good." Many Italians, especially those who fell in love with American women, chose to build their new lives in the United States. Overall, the conditions of Italian POWs in Allied captivity were good. Although the labor was hard, and they remained prisoners before anything, The men were treated well and in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Not all were so lucky, however. The armistice with the Allies produced an entirely new fate for Italian soldiers, those captured by the Reich. Following Italy's defection from the Axis, German troops swept into the kingdom and its territories during Operation Axis. The Italian army was in complete disarray and quickly collapsed. Some soldiers joined local partisan units or formed new ones. For them, the fight continued. Others would soon find themselves at gunpoint of their former allies. Many soldiers were forced to choose between fighting alongside Germans, disarming, or facing brutal reprisals. Although the exact numbers vary, it is estimated that the Reich captured some 800,000 prisoners. Here, much like the camps in the US and the UK, they were offered a choice to continue serving the Axis cause and join Mussolini's legions in northern Italy. The vast majority refused to return to the front, despite the tantalizing prospects to escape life in the German camps. The Germans saw the Italians not as prisoners, but as traitors. To Berlin, these men came from a government that had betrayed them twice, in 1915 and again in 1943. On top of that, Italian prisoners were treated without much sympathy from their fellow British, French, and Soviet prisoners. The Badoglio pigs, as the Germans called them, were deliberately assigned the label of Italian military internee, or IMI, to distinguish them from regular prisoners of war. By doing so, they were not legally protected by the Geneva Convention. Later in the war, many were again rebranded into civilian workers to eliminate the legal protection of the Red Cross as well. Italian POWs endured hard labor, poor shelter, and malnourishment. Hundreds died from tuberculosis, and thousands more from exhaustion and exposure in agriculture, mining, and filthy industrial workplaces. Some Italians who did not work hard enough were shot and killed by the guards. The annual mortality rate was about 40 per thousand, which is about 4 times higher than the average West European prisoner in German captivity. Even after Germany's surrender, the plight of some Italian prisoners continued. While many were released, others were reassigned by liberating nations like France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. There were 2 main ways for Italian captives to end up in the prison camps of the Soviet Union. Some were captured as part of the Italian army in Russia. Others ended up in the Russian cold after they were liberated from German captivity by the Red Army throughout 1945. For instance, soldiers interned in camps near Poznan in Poland were deported to a Soviet camp near Kharkiv. Of the some 65,000 Italians captured by the Soviets, only around 20,000 returned. Italian casualty rates in Soviet captivity were horrendously high. The rates among Italian POWs were around 57%, compared to 14% for the Germans or 30% for Romanians. These figures are in a large part due to the circumstances of their capture. Many Italians were captured at the Don front after the Battle of Stalingrad. Here, they had been forced to retreat on foot up to 500 kilometers or 310 miles with no supplies and temperatures reaching -30 Celsius or -22 Fahrenheit. Many succumbed to cold, hunger, typhus, and malnutrition. Numerous deaths occurred during the Divide marches to makeshift camps, railheads east of the Don, and during their transfers in overcrowded cattle cars. The conditions for these prisoners were appalling. The Italian representative to the Comintern appealed to Soviet authorities to improve conditions, emphasizing their potential as ideological converts. Many Italians volunteered for indoctrination programs, as the conditions here were better than those in ordinary camps. Despite the terrible conditions and mockery from Soviet soldiers, veterans recall the kindness, hospitality, and aid from Soviet civilians and local troops. While the fates of many Italians captured in the Soviet Union remained unknown throughout the Cold War, the Soviets were quick to begin and finish repatriation. Already on August 25, 1945, before Japan even surrendered, Moscow had made the decision to send prisoners home. The progress ended a little over a year later. In addition to those captured on foreign soil, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and bureaucrats became POWs in Italy, guarded by Italian soldiers. This bizarre situation resulted from Italy's civil war following its defection from the Axis. Those who served fascism in Italy experienced both lenient and extreme repercussions. After Mussolini's removal from power, the new government wasn't radically different from the previous regime. Although it aimed to punish fascists, the effort was extremely lackluster. For example, war criminal Mario Rota, responsible for ethnic cleansing in Slovenia, became chief of staff of the Italian army in the new regime and was entrusted by the new Badoglio regime to shoot peaceful protesters in Rome. He was only removed after Allied pressure. The military was barely purged, and the entire blackshirt brigades were repurposed into Royal Italian armies without screening or repercussions. High-ranking officers of the Italian Fascist Party even continued receiving stipends. However, as the fascist stronghold in the north crumbled by the war's end, the lenient tone shifted. Mussolini's violent death at the hands of partisans was indicative of the fate for many Italians who were in any way related to the fascist mission of the Republic of Salo. People's courts started trying fascists, encouraged by death warrants issued by the partisans. Although the Allies had declared that everyone who fought for Mussolini's Socialist Republic should be treated as POWs, the government and the emerged mobs did not share that view. The government wanted to punish the men and women as traitors, and the mobs wanted their heads. In cities like Milan, the Allied declaration was simply ignored. Although the government tried to stop the lynchings, especially after Mussolini's death, furious partisan mobs would regularly storm courtrooms and prisoners to try their fascist former oppressors by popular justice. Already in 1944, in recently liberated Rome, these partisans violently killed a former prison director who was responsible for the death of many of their relatives and friends. Just a year later, a group of masked partisans entered Schio prison and murdered 55 fascist inmates. While these lynchings took place, thousands more prisoners were rotting away in Italy's messy prisons, which were both extremely poorly run and overcrowded. In Coltano prison, where over 32,000 inmates were held, young men lived in an unpaved sea of mud, with scarce access to water and food. In nearby Casalina, a prison exclusive to women, the situation was deplorable, to a point where the Red Cross stepped in, citing the prison to be nothing more than a cesspool. These conditions were an embarrassment to the Italian authorities. Equally shameful were the stories of escapes. The camps had lax security, to the point where high-ranking fascist commanders could simply walk out of the front gates. Entrenched corruption meant that war criminals with friends in high places could place illegal release requests and then quickly hightail it to Switzerland or Spain. The partisan and political violence in Italy decreased considerably in 1946, as Italian leadership sought to distance themselves from the fascism which still permeated their government. The monarchy, largely seen as a fascist institution, had been abolished by popular vote. To mark Italy's rebirth as a united, democratic, and Western nation, the government proclaimed a general amnesty on June 22, 1946. The amnesty largely exonerated fascists and collaborators. Moderate Christian democratic factions in Italy relied on Christian virtues like mercy and forgiveness rather than further persecution and sanctions. Although these factions sought to heal the nation, the result was that thousands of fascists were simply let back into Italian society without any repercussions. Throughout these efforts to deal with the fascist legacy, The fates of Italian captured soldiers became a significant political asset. The new republic had to establish a narrative for itself as a Western democracy. The fates of the prisoners brutalized by the Nazis could be used to position Italy as a victim of Nazi aggression, while the fate of Italians in Soviet hands became a major political anti-communist cause. Despite their important contributions to the Allied war effort, those who had been in Western prisons were ultimately marginalized as an embarrassment to Italy's new identity as a Western democracy. In the decades after the war, memoirs from some soldiers say they still dreamt about and suffered from their time in captivity. Those who were in Russia were not taken seriously by local communist youths when they told their stories of suffering. Families were torn as brothers chose different loyalties. Soldiers returning home had no work and lived from a modest pension. Many returned with broken health. Not all returned to Italy, however. Many in the US or UK either stayed or returned there to build a new life. The German soldier's shovel pierces the soft loam. For the last year, he has worked on a farm in the southern United States, transferred to a labor detail after several months in a detention center. He and his fellows have spent their time laboring in the fields, watching American films, and thinking about what they'll do once the war is over. The Americans work their charges hard, but they are fed well and are treated better than the black sharecroppers who labor alongside them. Perhaps our soldier thinks he will have a new trade to practice when he returns home. The German soldier's shovel strains against the frozen earth. For the last year, he has worked in a graveyard in the Soviet Union, transferred to a labor detail after several months in a detention center. He and his fellows have spent their time shunting frozen corpses, languishing in Spartan barracks, and fighting desperately to survive. The Soviets work their charges hard, but the privations of war mean the communists can barely feed themselves, much less prisoners of war. Perhaps our soldier thinks he will soon join his former comrades who stare blankly at him from the pit. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. When VE Day was declared in 1945, the Allied powers held roughly 11 million German soldiers as prisoners of war. The vast majority of these, close to 8 million, had been captured by the Western Allies, while the remaining 3 million were in the custody of the Soviet Union. With Europe liberated from Nazi aggression, the Allied powers were left with a critical question: what to do with their 11 million POWs? The issue was a divisive one, to say the least, as while the Western Allies were signatories to the Geneva Convention, which very clearly demanded the release of prisoners the moment the war ended, the Soviets had notably abstained from signing the international agreement. This meant that a captured German soldier's fate was ostensibly decided by whose hands they fell into. But war is a brutal business, and sometimes even international law is just ink on a piece of paper. In today's episode, we will examine the various ends a German soldier could meet after 1945, as well as the fates of some of Germany's war criminals. In February of 1945, the Big Three Allied leaders, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin, met at Levadia Palace in Crimea. This Yalta Conference was meant to decide the ultimate fate of a defeated Germany. A key point of the agreement among the three men was that their foe must be brought to heel and rendered unable to threaten the world for a third time. In addition to dividing Germany into occupation zones and the idea of monetary reparations, the Big Three agreed that the German people themselves must be made to physically repair the damage their nation had done to Europe. This included conscripting POWs for forced labor, a practice Stalin and his advisors thought necessary and Roosevelt and Churchill regarded with tacit acceptance, but more on that later. During the war years, German soldiers were imprisoned in roughly 20 countries around the world, including in the continental United States. While stateside, many German prisoners were leased out to farms or factories to serve as laborers, providing additional hands to make up for the workers lost to the draft. A hotbed of this leasing activity was the southern US, where German POWs befriended American citizens and watched Hollywood films during their off hours. Overall, POWs sent to the US were treated humanely, and deaths of Germans in American custody were low at 491. Things were different in the internment camps in Europe, where American estimates for POWs who died in custody lie in the low thousands, while German tallies claim up to 40,000 fatalities in American custody. The Americans' early release of many prisoners complicates attaining an exact number. For their part, the British Empire managed the fate of up to 2.5 million German POWs by the war's end. Germans kept in Great Britain could be housed in anything from tents set up in a pastoral field to elegant manor houses repurposed as surprisingly posh prisons. Similar to their comrades in the US, German POWs in Britain enjoyed a cordial relationship with British civilians, who gave them money and foods that they were not usually fed. Germans in Britain could also be put onto a labor detail, for which they were paid a respectable 2 shillings per day of work. The number of German POWs who died in British custody was 1,254. British soldiers, as well as American, were also reported to have engaged in torture when interrogating Germans suspected of committing war crimes, often leading to confessions extracted under duress. But this was far from the worst a German captured on the Western Front could expect. That dubious dishonor lies with France. German soldiers captured during the liberation of France, as well as a number relocated there from American custody, faced abysmal conditions and vengeful civilians. French citizens would verbally harass or assault German prisoners, stoning or beating them, sometimes to death. Some POW camps seemed designed for extermination rather than detention. A French camp in the Sarthe gave its inmates only 900 calories worth of rations per day. For comparison, a Jew living in the early days of the Warsaw Ghetto was, on paper at least, allotted just over 1,000 calories of rations by the Nazis. An average of 12 POWs died daily at the Sarthe camp, and shortly after VE Day, the Red Cross reported that almost 200,000 German soldiers in French custody faced imminent starvation. The United States was forced to halt any further shipments of POWs to France and mandate their adherence to the Geneva Convention, an act that, in practice, was largely symbolic. The end of the war meant, according to international law, repatriation. But for the Western Allies, the end of the war largely seemed to mean reparation. The US and Britain leased roughly 1 million German POWs to the French to rebuild their country, while 64,000 went to Belgium, 10,000 to the Netherlands, and 5,000 to Luxembourg. Germans on the continent would assist in reconstruction, building roads or working in sawmills and quarries. Some in France and the Netherlands were made to clear minefields. 2,000 POWs were killed or maimed each month doing this. Conscripting the workers this way was a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, but the Western Allies claimed that since the German government technically did not exist, their charges were not prisoners of war and therefore were not entitled to the protections afforded to POWs. The Soviets had suffered greatly in their war against fascism, and they did not want a pound of flesh for their trouble. They wanted tons. Soviet plans for post-war reconstruction included the use of German POWs as forced labor as early as 1944. Ivan Maisky, Soviet ambassador to the British Empire, called for the Germans to be given as reparations to the Soviet Union for a lengthy period, which he ultimately defined as 10 years. Maisky would refine his proposal for the Yalta Conference and provided Stalin with a full-scale plan to get the USSR a supply of 5 million German POWs to be used as forced labor for a decade after victory was achieved. With this mass conscription and the planned seizure of German land and wealth, the Soviets hoped they could keep the German people from ever fighting against the USSR again. With the war's end and the carving of Germany into occupation zones, the Soviet plans were put into effect. Soviet authorities began identifying their new charges, with ethnic Germans in Soviet territory investigated to determine if they had served in the war. Any who had verifiable Wehrmacht service were ordered to Soviet POW camps to be prepared for forced labor. The Soviets would organize their new workers into battalions of 3,000 to 5,000 men, divided into 1,000-man companies. They were primarily used for construction and heavy industry, with a laser focus on rebuilding the utterly devastated Soviet Union. 3 million Germans would be drafted into the Soviet labor companies. A full third would die there. It should be noted, however, that this may not have been the result of direct Soviet action or negligence. Theirs was a war of annihilation, where both German and Soviet gave no quarter and expected none. Consequently, a number of the men forced into these labor companies were POWs captured by the Soviets directly, and due to the horrible conditions of the Eastern Front, came into Soviet custody malnourished, sick, utterly exhausted, or some combination of the three. But it would not have been pragmatic for the Soviets to intentionally slaughter their newly acquired labor pool so shortly after a war that devastated their working population. From 1945 to 1946, many POWs who were too sick to work were simply released by the Soviets rather than be worked to death. A bad harvest and endemic corruption and mismanagement seemed to be behind the travails of German forced laborers in the early post-war years. However, as time wore on, the German laborers began to prove more trouble than their Soviet masters thought them worth. POW labor was a surprisingly expensive enterprise and had to constantly be subsidized by the main Soviet economy. The Germans contributed roughly 5% of the Soviet Union's total national income, a far cry from the grand reparation envisioned by Maisky and his 10 years of servitude. In a surprisingly capitalist move, Soviet industrial leaders began to see their German workers as unprofitable and began to skimp on their responsibilities to feed and care for them. After all, why waste good money and materiel on what they saw as fascist parasites? As their industrial managers began to sour on the concept, Soviet leaders began making moves toward repatriation. In 1947, the foreign ministers of the Allied powers agreed that they would repatriate all German POWs by 1948. The Soviet effort would last well into 1950, with roughly 26,000 German POWs who had been convicted of war crimes by Soviet courts not sent back to Germany as late as 1956. Overall, Germans in the Soviet Union after the war were faced with mandatory hard labor under challenging conditions, but the majority were repatriated long before the initial plan of 10 years. But what of Germany's soldiers who had been discharged before the war's end, or who had deserted their Führer's crusade against the rest of the world, or who simply had been far enough away from the front lines that they were not captured? Those Germans who escaped capture and who were in the Western occupation zones found themselves cast adrift in a new Germany. The Allies were keen to strip Germany of any martial will, and to this end, of militarism of any military-inclined organization or club. This meant that German veterans of the Second World War, unlike their former foes, had no support system to help them transition back into civilian life. These suddenly demobilized soldiers found themselves in a country gripped by denazification. As the Western Allies sought to purge the influence of Hitler and Goebbels' propaganda machine and eliminate all traces of Nazi ideology and warmongering. To this end, former soldiers were ordered to present themselves to Allied tribunals for summary judgment. Originally run by the occupying forces before being handed off to German authorities in 1946, these tribunals would take stock of the defendants' military and civilian activities during the war. The court would then categorize the defendant as a major offender, lesser offender, follower, or give them a full exoneration. By and large, rank-and-file members of the Wehrmacht were categorized as lesser offenders and sentenced to a 3-year period of probation. During this time, they were prohibited from holding public office or running their own businesses. As more and more defendants were found or presented themselves, the tribunal system began to buckle under an ever-growing caseload, and judges began finding or making a multitude of exceptions to speed the process up. Disabled veterans were often exempted from judgment, along with those who could prove that they were impoverished during the war years or were born after 1919. While this system succeeded in streamlining the process of former Wehrmacht personnel, it allowed those with real Nazi sympathies to slip through the cracks. Denazification was abandoned in the 1950s, as its inefficiencies became more apparent, and the German public began pushing back on the idea of individual culpability. Why reckon with your part in crimes against humanity when you can simply pin it all on a dead Austrian painter and move on with your life? In one of history's moments of irony, many former Wehrmacht personnel, judged by the Allies for their service, would soon find themselves right back in uniform. With the growing threat of the Soviets to the east, the Allied powers realized that a militarized Germany would prove a keen ally should the world descend into another global conflict. The Bundeswehr was established in November of 1955, and many former Wehrmacht soldiers could be found in its ranks, sometimes wielding the same weapons they used to fight against the Allies. The war criminals of Nazi Germany, from the highest echelons of military and civilian leadership to rank-and-file guards, were arraigned on charges of crimes against humanity and prosecuted at a series of trials, most famously at Nuremberg. Prosecutors from all Allied nations presented a preponderance of evidence, ranging from private diaries to ledgers of concentration camps to military dispatches. The prosecution's point was clear. The military was equally responsible for Hitler's horrors as the SS and civilian leadership. There was no distinction to be drawn between the independent and politically minded SS and the duly enlisted soldiers of the Wehrmacht. While separate, these two cogs in Hitler's machine of annihilation would often work in sinister concert. The Wehrmacht would take an area, and the SS would purge it of undesirables. Military officers, such as Keitel, and high ministers, like Ribbentrop, were hanged, while others were sentenced to prison terms, ranging from life to time served. Others, such as Hermann Göring, took their own lives rather than face the hangman. There were even a few female defendants, such as the sadistic hyena of Auschwitz, Irma Grese. Grese was ultimately hanged for her brutal treatment of concentration camp inmates, unusual for a time when executing women was a stark rarity. But these people were still allowed a defense, and theirs was simple. We were just following orders. The thrust of these arguments was that any Nazi soldier, officer, official, or minister accused of crimes against humanity was simply following a directive from a higher authority. Some, in fact, falsified orders to show that they had no choice in the matter, creating false paper trails to justify their own malice and cruelty toward Jews, Roma, LGBTQ people, and others the Nazi Party declared undesirable. Many of these false stories were pushed by the defendants' families who were tired of the war, tired of the reckoning, and just wanted their sons, daughters, husbands, or wives home, whether they were a monster or not. This attitude began to pervade German public consciousness with unfortunate results. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, a new German state for a new German people. The first chancellor of this new Germany, Konrad Adenauer, opened his tenure by announcing plans for a general amnesty for war criminals who had been sentenced by the occupying powers. The desire for Germany to be an ally against possible Soviet aggression trumped the desire for justice, and spring of 1950 saw the Advisory Board on Clemency for War Criminals established to review cases for leniency. 105 cases were brought to the Advisory Board in August of 1950 as family and friends of convicted war criminals, as well as representatives of the new German government, presented all manner of mitigating evidence, from medical history to the newly birthed clean Wehrmacht myth, which stated emphatically that all Nazi crimes were the fault of the SS and Hitler's inner circle. Proponents of the clean Wehrmacht myth argue to this day that the common soldier of Nazi Germany was an honorable, chivalrous man, fighting for home and hearth, untainted by the atrocities of his peers and the hateful rhetoric of his leaders. 84 of the 105 cases heard by the Advisory Board were dramatically lessened or outright commuted, and the fairy tale myth of the clean Wehrmacht spread through the German populace. Generations of Germans believed in a sharp divide between their ancestors who fought for Hitler and his crimes, eager to compartmentalize the shame of their nation's atrocities and their own family histories. War, like history, is never simple nor clean. The soldiers of Germany captured on the battlefield rightfully expected to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and in many cases they were, until the war's end. The pragmatic and vindictive moves by the Allies to force German POWs into rebuilding Europe do not excuse the crimes of Nazi Germany, just as Nazi atrocities do not excuse Allied violations of the Geneva Convention. It is imperative that we remember history is not entirely black and white, but rather painted shades of gray, with definite areas of clear morality and humanity. To simplify history into West versus East, good versus evil, or any dichotomy is to ignore the true lessons our history has to teach us, and the most profound lessons are often to be learned in its darkest chapters. A Japanese soldier stares out the glass of his train car. It has been a long road from the front line back home, but he is thankful to see the end of it. Those final desperate days in the sweltering jungles, the shame of surrendering, his internment by the Americans, all begin to fall away as familiar rooftops come into view. He is finally home. A Japanese soldier stares through the bars of his rolling prison. It has been a long road from the front line to wherever this is, but he is thankful to see the end of it. The sudden invasion by the Soviets, the shame of surrendering, the internment in conditions barely suited to cattle all begin to fall away, replaced by something far worse. He is finally in Siberia. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Regular viewers will recall our video on the fates of German soldiers after the Second World War, in which the ultimate destiny of former Axis fighters depended largely on whose custody they came into: the Western Allies, such as the United States and United Kingdom, or the Soviet Union. In one of history's many parallels, the same is true for the war in the Pacific. The fates of Japanese personnel after the war was directly tied to the Allied power they were fighting when the Emperor made his historic broadcast. In this video, we will revisit the topic of Axis soldiers after the Second World War and see the varied and sometimes inhumane fates of the soldiers who fought to dominate Asia. The war between Japan and the Allied powers lasted a total of 3 years and 8 months, from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and its accompanying Asian blitzkrieg to when the atom bombs fell, though the war in China had been on for some time. Japan's men in uniform did not find out about their country's surrender immediately. Veteran and Japanese Prime Minister Tomishi Maruyama recalled that he and other soldiers heard the news hours after the radio announcement from our superiors. At first, I felt bad that we had lost, but some of us were at the same time relieved because it was a long time coming. While Japanese troops throughout the Pacific region would hear of their country's surrender over the next several weeks. With the end of the war came the American occupation of Japan from August 1945 to May of 1952, a period of almost 7 years. Japan functioned as a colony during this period with no military or political independence. All decisions of the neutered Japanese government had to be approved by the United States. This was the world into which demobilized Japanese soldiers returned, if they did at all. The end of the war is usually associated with homecomings and happy reunions, but for the Japanese soldier, the end of the war meant uncertainty, as he made his way back to a homeland he no longer recognized. While the conflict was ongoing, the Japanese government made it extraordinarily difficult for captured soldiers to contact their families. And propagandists in the military pushed the narrative that surrender was as dishonorable as it was impossible. A Japanese soldier was expected to fight to the death, and if for some reason he couldn't, honor demanded he take his own life. To surrender was not only to invite the greatest shame upon yourself, but also to horribly dishonor your family and forfeit one's very identity as Japanese. To spare their families the shame being associated with them, returning Japanese POWs would often not mention their capture to family and friends, hiding what they were told was the most mortifying, unforgivable sin they had ever committed in their lives. The Western Allies had no interest whatsoever in keeping Japanese POWs on hand. Unlike their German counterparts, the Japanese were not leased out to reconstruct shattered infrastructure or press-ganged to clear minefields. The rump Japanese government called for their repatriation, and in concert with the Americans had made provisions for getting the demobilized men home. Repatriation began in December of 1945, with the sick or wounded, ethnic Taiwanese or Koreans, and all Japanese soldiers in China pushed to the front of the line. The returning soldiers were forced to exchange any foreign money they'd come into for the rapidly crashing yen, but were far more eager to exchange their prison clothes for old uniforms. While they waited for their turn to head home, they were housed in either old barracks or warehouses at their ports of entry, with basic furniture and no protection from the chill of the Japanese winter. Conditions were squalid to the point that one returning soldier noted he wished he'd stay in the Philippines. When it came time for the repatriates to complete their journey, they were given enough money for train fare and enough rations to see them through. The arrival home was not always a happy one. Families of POWs sometimes wrongly received notices of death, an intentional distortion on the government's part, so it's easy to imagine the emotional shock of seeing your dead husband, brother, or son walk through the front door. The returning soldiers limped through the streets of their hometowns, often still wearing surplus uniforms given to them by their former captors, and sometimes reduced to begging from American troops. Though many Japanese civilians privately supported their returning veterans, the loss of the war and overnight restructuring of their society was too fresh of a wound, and some soldiers were greeted with outright hostility by the same crowds that once cheered them as heroes. "They came home quietly," said Toru Takaya, a high school student at the time. "Some of the soldiers told me that when they left to join the war, everyone cheered and sent them off, but when they came back, there was nothing. People looked at them coldly." Regardless of how they were received, it was all too common for returning soldiers to suffer a psychological collapse, and many who made it back to their hometowns simply walked into their homes, closed the door, and were never seen again. The Soviet Union and Japanese Empire had spent the war in a state of armed non-aggression, each eyeing the other while dealing with the pressing matters of Nazi Germany and the United States, respectively. On August 15, 1945, the Soviets defeated the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, ending their war with Japan. 3 days later, Stalin ordered the transfer of all Japanese soldiers to the Soviet Union. POWs were stripped of all of their valuables by the Soviets, left with only the clothes on their backs. They would endure a long journey into the USSR, punctuated by dragging marches between camps, the sight of Japanese women assaulted by Red Army troops, and the jeers and jubilation of the natives at the Japanese defeat. But at the end of it all, they had optimism that they would eventually be returning home. The internees were poorly cared for, as the Soviets put their effort primarily towards stripping their newly acquired territory of anything of value. The nakedly named Committee on Exporting Trophy Equipment from Manchuria oversaw the pilfering of Manchuria and other Japanese territories of anything, regardless of size, that could support the rebuilding of the Soviet economy, leaving little food or supplies for the POWs. Thanks to the efforts of the Export Committee, huge trains full of loot were soon steaming toward the Soviet Union. Packed in with vast quantities of stolen war materiel were tens of thousands of Japanese POWs. These supremely unfortunate men were in for a terrible shock, as some believed they were headed back home. Instead, the Soviets took many of their charges to internment camps in Siberia, the infamous wilderness long used to house political prisoners and enemies of the state. Winter set in hard and early, with temperatures dropping well below freezing. Fortunately, the Soviets were careful to equip the transport trains with stoves and heating equipment when they were sent back in 1947. The Japanese who were transported to Siberia battled the elements on their own, with those who touched the metal surfaces of their train cars losing the skin off their hands. Conditions were no better when they arrived at the camps themselves. The extreme cold caused the Japanese soldiers' bodies to go into survival mode, increasing their blood circulation to stave off frostbite. But the increased activity also meant they could barely sleep. When they tried, the men huddled in tangled masses, not only to conserve body heat, but because their barracks were often overcrowded. Latrines were separated from the barracks, and if a late-night visit was required, the returning POW would often find that his sleeping spot had been filled in by his fellows. These privations meant that internees required medical attention, and the camp infirmaries were staffed by many female doctors and nurses. To the Japanese, this was a humiliation, as the female staff would inspect them from head to toe every month, and shave them to prevent infestations of lice. It must be noted that this was not part of some malevolent design to shame and psychologically wound the POWs, but rather a matter of necessity. The Soviet Union had lost over 200,000 male medical personnel in the war, and fully qualified women were available to make up the shortfall. However, these effects were present regardless of intent. It is important at this moment to make a simple statement. It is a fact of history that the Empire of Japan horribly abused civilians and POWs alike throughout the war, embarking on programs of forced labor, human experimentation, sexual exploitation, and other cruelties petty and expansive. This bears no denial. The purpose of this examination is not to paint the Empire of Japan as a victim nation, but to explore the after effects of the Second World War, and it is incumbent on us to report them objectively. The Soviets abused the Japanese as they abused the Germans, as the Japanese abused the Chinese, Filipinos, Malaysians, Vietnamese, Dutch, Americans, British, and so on. While the camps in Siberia were certainly hellacious, there were internment centers built all around the Soviet Union. The Central Asia regions of the USSR were home to camps that reached sweltering summer temperatures, while some Japanese found themselves imprisoned in the underground wastes of Vorkuta. Wherever they were imprisoned, the Japanese were expected to do their bit to rebuild the Soviet economy. In the same breath as he ordered the initial internments in Siberia, Stalin ordered that the Japanese POWs be used as laborers to repair the damage they and their Axis partners did to the workers' paradise. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police and precursor to the KGB, was put in charge of dividing the POWs into 1,000-man labor battalions, the vast majority of which were used to build roads, lay rail, and construct or repair bridges and other transport infrastructure. Others were put to work as industrial workers or lumberjacks, whatever would benefit the Soviet economy. The variety and intensity of a POW's labor was a matter of chance. What camp they were imprisoned in, the effect the war had on the surrounding area, how many workers were available, and what would be the most advantageous to Stalin's plans. The conditions of labor were equally varied, with some camps hosting a workforce of relatively healthy internees who finished their tasks by midday, while other camps hosted ill-cared-for men who regularly failed to meet quotas. Though their experiences were diverse, all Japanese POWs shared memories of the work being hard, grueling, and punishing. Japanese soldiers who were in training or otherwise off the field of battle when surrender was announced were taken in by the Japanese government, who wished to quickly and efficiently demobilize them. Despite their junior position in the power dynamic, the government in Tokyo pushed to get these men processed, employed, and back to civilian life. American authorities assessed them for what skills they could bring to the post-war country, with those possessing valuable training in civilian trades sent home before others. Skills also determined the amount of rations and other goods the government would issue a demobilized soldier. As more and more soldiers came home, the Japanese government steered them toward jobs in the agricultural and industrial sectors, incentivizing businesses to hire returning veterans. Others were enlisted as laborers for the American occupiers, servicing vehicles and working to rebuild the broken Japanese transport system. The headquarters of the American occupation in Beppu was built with no small amount of demobilized labor, and Japanese workers were a fixture in the building's kitchen. But some Japanese who weren't captured took a different tack. For them, the war was not over. At its height, the Japanese Empire controlled over 20 million square miles, or roughly 51 million square kilometers of territory. Such expansive holdings naturally meant that news of surrender was slow to reach isolated garrisons and positions, especially in the remotest jungles and island groups. Isolated and filled with warrior spirit, some groups of soldiers fought on, either unaware or unheeding of the surrender. One such lone soldier was Corporal Soichi Yokoi, who lived in the jungles of Guam for 28 years as a holdout. When the US retook Guam, Yokoi's regiment was all but annihilated, and he was recorded as one of the dead. He lived in solitude until a pair of fishermen discovered Yokoi checking shrimp traps along a river. Yokoi attacked the fishermen and was subdued by the anglers, who, to Yokoi's surprise, took him home and fed him rather than dispatch the lone warrior. Yokoi was ultimately demobilized in 1972 and wrote a book about his years in the jungle. But the most famous of these cases was the detachment of Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, whose small group conducted a guerrilla war against the Philippine government until 1974, when the now lone Onoda was coaxed out of hiding and formally relieved of duty by his very much retired commanding officer. Like the Nazis, the Japanese committed a variety of crimes against humanity that demanded prosecution. War criminals were imprisoned near where they were captured, with jails in Hong Kong, Burma, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies holding those awaiting trial. The Prisoner of War Information Bureau, or POWIB, was a key participant in preparing for trials in that they actively interfered in the process. Japanese authorities encouraged the POWIB to withhold information from Allied prosecutors, a demand the ostensibly neutral body assented to, categorizing their files on POWs and their personal histories as for active release, and release only if required. The situation was further complicated by both the POWIB and Japanese government lacking English-speaking personnel who could interface with the American occupation forces and other Allied leaders. The Potsdam Declaration, which laid out the terms of Japanese surrender, declared there must be eliminated for all time the authority and influence of those who have deceived and misled the people of Japan into embarking on world conquest. And to this end, the Tokyo trials were convened. 28 members of the Japanese government, including military dictator and survivor of a failed suicide attempt, Hideki Tojo, stood trial for a litany of horrors stretching from the time the first Japanese soldiers stepped onto Chinese soil through the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The proceedings lasted until 1948, by which time 2 defendants died of natural causes. 7 of the 28 were sentenced to death, including the aforementioned Tojo. The 28 at the Tokyo trials were considered Class A or highly ranking war criminals. Thousands of lesser offenders were tried in municipal courts throughout Allied territories in the Pacific. The Tokyo trials ultimately lasted 2 times as long as their counterpart in Nuremberg, and were similarly effective in the establishment of international law concerning crimes against humanity. The Empire of Japan entered the Second World War to create a zone of hegemony in Asia, but would leave the war a ruined nation, her soldiers coming home in shame or being shipped off to labor camps in the Soviet Union. Japan would never wage an offensive war again, and would effectively be an American puppet state until 1952. The fallout of Japan's defeat is especially sad, a depressing end to an orgy of violence and hatred, with few peers in the journals of man's inhumanity to man. Thanks again to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video. Start your programming journey today by scanning the QR code or clicking our link in the description, and use code ArmchairHistorian for 25% off of your first year on the annual plan.